Welcome back to the Rethinking Community Conference here at Wake Forest. I'm Zerlina Maxwell. I'm the Director of Progressing Programming for SiriusXM Satellite Radio. And if it's not your first time here today, I'm the MC, and I'm just getting us smoothly through the schedule. I did get a chance to go across the hall and talk to some of the students at the hub, and I was really interested in the conversation that's going on with the student government right now. In terms of the new code of conduct. They were telling me a little bit about the changes that a lot of schools, not just Wake Forest, are making to the code of conduct in curbing some of the student protests on campus. And this is not the first conversation I've had with student government leaders across the country, so I think that's something that's not only relevant to our conversations today, but also clearly something that campuses all over the country are having to deal with because in the uptick in protests with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also in response to some of the policies of this current administration. So I think this could not be a more timely moment to have these conversations. I wanted to give everybody two reminders. First, we will reconvene this evening at 7 p.m. in Waite Chapel for a timely conversation on sports and community led by Dave Zirin, a political sports writer for The Nation magazine, featuring Mohammed Abdul-Raoul, speaker activist and former NBA professional basketball player, the legend John Carlos, everybody knows the famous Olympian power fist pose, photograph of USA track and field fame and bronze medalist at the 1968 Olympic Games, and Ibtihaj Muhammad, world champion team 2014, four-time senior world medalist, three-time U.S. national champion on the USA fencing team. I'm sure you all saw her in the most recent Olympic Games. She's amazing. Second, don't forget the conference continues with a full schedule of events tomorrow. On Saturday, events begin promptly at 8:30 a.m. at Biotech Place in downtown Winston-Salem, so make sure to head over 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. The full schedule is on your program, which you should have received in your swag bags. And now we'll move on to our closing plenary of this part of the day again, and I will introduce you to Melissa Harris-Perry.
So I want to take just a moment to say a couple of thank yous. Again, I want to say thank you to our primary financial sponsor, who is the Rethinking Community Provost panel. So if you'll remember again that this entire conference is responsive to the call from Provost Kirsch that the entire university community spend the year rethinking community. And so there is a university-wide effort to rethink community. There are a wide number of events happening across the university over the course of this year. If you go to the Wake Forest University's website, you'll see under the Provost's office, under Rethinking Community, a number of other events, not necessarily associated with this conference per se, but that will go on over the course of the year, that will continue to take up many of the issues and concerns that we are beginning here today and over the course of the next 2 days. The second set of thank yous I want to say are to the teams that were so crucial in helping to put this conference together. Again, remembering that we're only just halfway because we have a full schedule of events tomorrow as well as a big event this evening. And I just want to say thank you to the team first at PHI, starting with our executive director, Marianne Majuka, to our director of academic and community engagement programs, who is largely responsible for everything that is going to happen tomorrow, Shelley Sizemore, also to Alana James, who is part of our team under the Provost's office down at Biotech Place and Wake downtown. Again, Alana James downtown. And of course, to Rolisa Tutwiler and to Malika Starnes, who is not here today, but who is responsible for so much of the coordination of everything that is happening, as well as to some of our most junior staffers who have been involved in every single aspect of what's going on here, including our student aspects, including Fahim Ghulamali and Chizoba Yukairo. Now I want to also say thank you, again, really a distinct thank you to the team at EI. You know, you call someone sort of out of the blue and say, hey, we haven't worked together before, but how about we throw a big, huge national conference in, I don't know, 6 weeks? How would that be?
The answer is yes.
Yeah, and literally that's what we got. The answer is yes. And then as we kept working together, it was, you know, we'd say, oh, you know, we need an idea. And they'd give us an idea, Adam and Jim. Or we'd say, you know, oh, you know, we've run up against a problem. Oh, here, how can we help? Or if we would get a success, guess who said yes? Man, that's great, y'all. I have to say, it really is a joy to work with this team. And then, like, right at the end, when finally Adam and Jim got a little bit of help as well, and the EI team grew as well, and so we've been stuffing bags together, and you know, to just look across the table and have someone say, oh, we're going to be there every minute of the conference. What a pleasure. And so as a result, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jim Otteson. I've gotten a chance to know Jim and his team at the EI quite well during the past few weeks. It is the kind of intimacy that can only be forged in that particular heat generated by the fiery hazing of planning a national conference in 6 weeks. And it will not surprise you to learn that the faculty director of the Pro Humanitate Institute and the executive director of the Eudaimonia Institute are quite different from one another. I am long-winded and mean-spirited. Jim is reserved and kind. I cannot carry a tune in a bucket, whereas it turns out Jim studied musical theater and has the voice of an angel. But in other ways, we are actually quite similar. Having both spent formative intellectual years at the University of Chicago, Jim as a graduate student and I as a junior faculty member, we share a common belief that nothing demonstrates respect for one another quite so much as the willingness to spar full out in an intellectual death match, then dust off and go at it again in the morning. I actually profoundly enjoy the kind of breadcrumbs that Jim leaves for us as he winds his way up a scholarly path, building an economic or moral or political argument. As a political philosopher with expertise in both moral philosophy and political economy, Jim's work and writings reach as far back as the 18th century, connecting to the core underpinnings of Adam Smith, the foundational concerns of functioning capitalism, reaching as far forward as contemporary public policy and institutional choices. Jim joined the Wake Forest faculty in the fall of 2013 as executive director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism and as teaching professor of political economy. And in 2015, he was named the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics. And in 2016, he was named professor of economics and is currently, again, the executive director of EI. Let me just say one of my favorite moments of conference planning. It happened in early September. Now, I am an internet stalker. When I'm getting to know someone, I read. I read not only their scholarly writings, I search around. I see what they're tweeting. I look at what they're writing on their blog.
You mean nervous?
Jim left a breadcrumb on his blog in early September. It was just a little cryptic quote from Frank Knight from a 1960 text, Intelligence and Democratic Action. It's a long quote arguing against the use of the word science to describe social science, which cracks me up all by itself. But this was the part I most enjoyed. One both knows and influences others primarily by meaningful intercommunication, which we don't have with natural objects and which they do not have with each other. It's essentially a mutual relation, where that of men to nature is unidirectional. Physical objects do not know or use men or strive to do so. Once again, though, one both knows and influences others primarily by meaningful intercommunication. This just showed up on the blog while we were beginning to plan this conference. I took it as a sign of a shared value. It has proven to be so. Jim is joined in this conversation by Sarah Brown, a staff reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education who covers a range of topics and daily news focused on American campus life. Sarah, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with sort of the campus climate issues and the speech controversies and that have seemed to grip American college campuses in recent months, where it seems often that there's a dearth of productive discussion and debate. It seems every week there's a new headline about students and a controversial speaker clashing. Just a couple of weeks ago at Columbia University, a range of student protesters shouted down an anti-Islam activist who was speaking via Skype and actually prevented that speaker from continuing his speech. And that was one of at least three incidents within a 2-week period of students basically preventing a speaker from continuing a speech. In some cases, I'll add, these speakers are not just controversial, they are overtly racist and sexist. As many of you probably know, Richard Spencer is one who has been targeting college campuses. He is a white supremacist. He spoke just yesterday at the University of Florida, and he is clearly targeting people from minority communities. And since the election of Donald Trump, we have seen on college campuses an uptick in hate-motivated and racially charged incidents. And in addition to that, it seems that extremists have been emboldened to speak more loudly and to target college campuses in some ways. So that's sort of, and then all of that plays out on social media, which just adds fuel to the fire. So that's kind of the environment that I've been reporting on campuses in recent months. And so today I want to raise 3 of the key questions that universities are grappling with right now, that I'm talking about with university presidents, administrators, faculty members, students, and others. And some of these issues were touched on a little bit earlier, but I figured we could explore them in a bit more depth. So the first question is that some students talk about safety in the context of intellectual discussion and debate. What does it mean to have a space that is safe for learning and for debate for all students? Or is that just not what universities are in the business of doing? On a related note, at what point does speech become violent or threatening, and does it not become protected by the First Amendment, and can words alone make a space unsafe for learning and debate? So that's the first question. The second one is...
All one question?
Yes. The second was that what does it mean for a university in this current climate and polarized climate to support free speech unequivocally when in a climate where white supremacists and other extremists are targeting campuses? Does that stance pose a risk to campus communities? And the third one, which hits on a fundamental part of what this whole conference is about: how can colleges teach students to engage in civil debate and discussion, to listen to one another and respect opposing views in a politically polarized moment like this one? So I will add a little bit of context to each of those 3 questions. So first of all, on safety. Universities are obviously responsible for ensuring the physical safety of their students, but what about safety in the context of a difficult conversation and in the context of grappling with controversial questions? In late 2015, some of you all may be familiar with this, a video went viral of a Yale University student engaging with one of her professors in a raised voice and using expletives, and she's a Black woman, and she accused this professor of creating an unsafe space for students of color at Yale, when his job was to help, in her view, was to help create an environment of comfort and home for students. She told him, "It is not about creating an intellectual space, it is about creating a home here." And while that video, which went viral, was taken out of context, it was in the context of basically students of color at Yale protesting systemic racism on campus. But when I've talked to students, they tell me, of course I want to engage in intellectual and difficult debate, but I don't want to have my identity attacked in the midst of these debates. I shouldn't have to engage with people who are just using racist and hateful rhetoric or questioning everything about who I am or what perspective I bring. And then on the question of violence, as someone like Richard Spencer, a white supremacist, is his rhetoric and that of his supporters equivalent to violence? So that's the safety piece. The second is, what does it mean for a university to unequivocally support freedom of speech in this polarized climate? And in my reporting, I've seen a range of stances taken by college presidents when speech controversies erupt on campuses. So, for example, students clashing with a speaker. And some college leaders say free speech is essential. You can't shout down speakers. We will not disinvite speakers, even if their views are abhorrent and offensive. We will not have free speech zones, which means we're not going to restrict the places where students can express themselves. Some universities have gone a step further in recent years, and they've adopted a set of principles called the Chicago Principles, which basically lay out a very adamant defense of free speech and why universities should absolutely uphold free expression. So other college presidents that I've talked to acknowledge the viewpoints more prominently of concerned students and sort of think it's worth asking the question of whether certain people, certain firebrands add anything to an intellectual and academic debate. In some cases, they've canceled planned speakers in response to student outrage. So, you know, in some cases, things when controversial speakers have come to campuses have gotten violent, as they did in Charlottesville. So that raises the question again, if when you support free speech, what risk does that bring? And the last thing I'll bring a little bit of context to is how colleges can teach students to engage in civil discussion and debate. There is a narrative emerging that I'm sure many of you are familiar with outside of higher ed, that students aren't supportive of free speech in that they believe that some hate speech, for example, expression that targets particular minority communities, shouldn't be protected. There's also a narrative that students are unwilling to engage in difficult debates, that they demand trigger warnings and just retreat to their safe space. It's the snowflake argument. And while my reporting has sort of informed me that that's not the case, it's more complicated than that, there is a concern among administrators that I talk to that students don't know how to engage in a productive discussion and debate, and that they're having trouble listening to one another. Some universities are teaching about this at orientation, at freshman orientation. Someone else suggested to me that colleges invest more in debate clubs and make debate class a graduation requirement. So that's another thing that I would like to grapple with. So now I will turn it over to Jim, and I will pose that first question of what does it mean for a space to be safe for learning and for debate, or are universities not in that business at all?
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's a lot to think about. Let me start by saying thank you to Melissa for that very kind introduction. And it has been a pleasure, really a double pleasure, to help plan this conference. Not just a pleasure to work with Melissa and her team, but also to really be thinking about what should a university be? What's the kind of thing that a university ought to do? I think some of the criticisms of what goes on college campuses, especially from outside of college campuses, people who are not on them, and they look at the sensational stories. You get a few students who do crazy things, and of course, that's what the media writes about. They don't write about the 95% of students who are just trying to get an A on their next paper and want to go to class. So when you look at some of those criticisms and the controversies that have gone on campus, I think that part of the reason for the controversies is because we have something of a crisis of not just free speech versus safe spaces, although that's an important one. I have something to say about that too, but give me a second. Not just free speech versus safe spaces or the various issues involved with that, but really a kind of crisis of identity. What I mean by that is, what's a university supposed to be for? So some of you may know a psychologist at NYU named Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt's been giving talks on college campuses over the last year and a half or so, where he's been arguing that we have these two competing views of what universities are about in America. On the one hand, you have a view that a university is supposed to be about the disinterested pursuit of truth wherever it leads, open marketplace of ideas, but really the chief value is truth. On the other hand, he claims, you have a different view of what a university is supposed to be about, and he calls it the social justice view. So he says this other view holds that what universities ought to be about is molding characters. So you remember, for those of you who were here a little earlier, Professor Diner mentioned that he read some of these passages from people in the 19th century who were talking about the purpose of college education and said things like molding the character of young men, and nobody talks quite like that anymore. But I think there is something of that view, or at least this is the argument that Haidt makes, that there is something of the view that at least part of the purpose of a college education shouldn't be only to impart, say, information, or maybe information, knowledge, and even skills, but also a certain kind of moral character. Now, Haidt argues that those two things are in conflict, and I think that there is something to the idea that maybe we aren't really sure what a university is supposed to be about. My first job out of graduate school was teaching at a large state university. And we used to talk about this all the time. What exactly are we doing here? So this state university had programs in everything. So almost every aspect of a student's life, from health and nutrition to social life to what you were studying, all aspects were covered in some way or other by the university. And one of the criticisms that some people raised was, well, if you're trying to be everything to students, well, then you're not going to do anything very well. And we had these arguments. I was on the faculty, this is at the University of Alabama. It was my first job out of graduate school. I hadn't been to the state of Alabama before I went to interview for the job. But I was on the faculty senate there. We used to argue about, well, should we have these kinds of programs and those kinds of programs, and what do we do about this? But it occurred to me then, and I think this is something that, if anything, has gotten more acute since then, that there wasn't really a consensus about what a university was supposed to be. It was a kind of ongoing operation that had staff and administrators and faculty and students and hospitals and nurses and counselors and climbing walls and lazy rivers. It had all sorts of things going on. And it was something like a time for students between graduating high school when their parents needed them to get out of the house and when you had to become an adult and start your real life, to just spend, as we used to joke, the best 6 years of your life, picking and choosing different things for different people. One of the problems with that, and I think it's an ongoing problem, is that there didn't seem to be any single view, any consensus about what a university is really supposed to be about. So what's the answer to that question? I'm going to be a typical philosopher in maybe the Chicago style. I'm going to give you a non-answer answer. My answer is, that's something we need to actually be talking about. Faculty need to be asking themselves, what exactly is it we think we're about? Now, that brings this back to this conference. When I said it was a double pleasure working with the Pro Humanitate Institute and Melissa and her team, this gives us an opportunity to actually think about, what are we supposed to be doing? What is it that we're supposed to be telling students that is the purpose for them to take these years, these very precious, productive years? They're very scarce resources, and by the way, we charge a rather large amount for it. We ought to be able to make a case to them, shouldn't we? Not just to them, but to their parents, to the community. This is worth doing, and you can't make a case like that unless you have a sense of what it is we're doing. So this brings us back, I think, to first principles. You don't know why you're doing something until you ask yourself the question, why? What's the purpose? What's the mission? And I think that has to be the first question. So for any student, for any faculty member, so I teach a course here in the School of Business called Why Business, with a question mark. What's the role of business in a humane and just society? Now just imagine that for a second. I teach a course in the business school to business students called Why Business. And what I ask the students in that class is to ask themselves, well, what are you doing this for? That's a really important question that not enough of us ask. We have to remember, so I'm going to tell you what I sometimes tell my students in that course. What's your most precious, scarce resource in life? Now, if there are students in here, you will know the answer to that. It's your time. Your time on this earth is absolutely limited. You started, there was a moment when you started, and I'm very sorry to say, there will be a moment when you will end. You cannot manufacture any more time. That's all the time you have. That means that every year, every month, every week, every minute you spend doing one thing is a minute that is gone forever in the history of the universe. So make it count. Now, how do you know if you make it count? You have to ask yourself, what am I doing? That brings you to, as I say, first principles. So the institute that we founded here a year ago, it's called the Eudaimonia Institute. It's one of the two unable to be pronounced institutes on campus here. Eudaimonia, this is an ancient Greek word. It's hard to translate, which is one reason why we called the institute, if we called it the Happiness Institute, that's bad. We don't want to call it that. The word eudaimonia is often translated as happiness, and that gets at a part of it, but it's a much deeper sense of it's a much deeper concept than the word happiness usually means. Here's the idea, at least as I understand it. What we need to do, what any individual needs to do, if you want to figure out what you ought to be doing right now, and I don't mean, what job are you going to have one day, or what are you going to major in, although those are important, but what are you doing right now? You need to know, what do you want to have done by the end? When you are at the end of your life, looking back on it, what kind of life can you have led that you will say, that was a life worth having been led? I didn't squander the opportunities available to me. I didn't throw away the gifts and the privileges I had. You have to ask yourself that, and one way to think about it is asking yourself, what will I want to have accomplished by the end of my life? And then you just reverse engineer. In order to have that view at the end of my life, that means that 20 years from now, I want to have done this. 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 1 week from right now. You're leading the right kind of life for you if you've figured out how all of those intermediary steps lead to the final end. Now, I have a view about what that would be, but importantly, I think, each person is going to have a unique journey based on the unique end. And that's because we are, each of us, precious and unique. Every single person has a unique set of skills, abilities, and privileges. And if you'll allow me for a second, one thing we haven't really talked about today is privilege. So we've talked about community. We've talked about the role of universities in the community. We haven't talked about privilege. I consider myself to be very privileged. And if you'll indulge me for just a second, I'm going to tell you part of what I mean by that. Luck and privilege play a pretty big role, and I think at just about everybody's life. They certainly have in mine. I was the first person in my family to graduate college. College wasn't the sort of thing that people did in my family. For some reason that I still don't quite understand, my mother decided that I would be the person to go to college. I got really lucky. I had a mother who wanted me to go to college. So my mother and father divorced when I was 1. I wasn't raised by my father. I was raised by my mother. I was born in 1968. 1968 was a very different time from today. Some of you may remember 1968. My mother, as a divorced woman, so she had me when she was 19. She got divorced when she was 20. A 20-year-old divorced woman with a child was considered by many people to be, this was a moral stain on her character. So she had a hard time getting a job. She had a hard time renting an apartment. People wouldn't let her live in their apartments because this meant she was somehow morally questionable. But I was very lucky and I still feel very privileged that she, for some reason, wanted me to go to college. She was able to, by the time I got to the high school age, she was able to scrape together enough money for me to be able to go to what she thought was the best school in the town. I grew up in Joliet, Illinois. Some of you may know Joliet if you remember the Blues Brothers movie. Joliet, Jake, okay. So there was a Catholic high school. She wanted me to go to the Catholic high school. We weren't Catholic, but she wanted me to go to the Catholic high school because she thought that would be good for me. I had gotten into a lot of trouble as a younger kid. She thought it would straighten me out, put me on the straight and narrow. So I went to this high school. So I got in and went to this high school. This happened to be the high school. Has anybody seen the movie Rudy? I went to the high school that Rudy went to. So that's the high school I went. I didn't know anything about Rudy until the movie came out. But so I went to that high school. a very lucky accident. So when it came time for my friends, my peers, to be applying to college, I didn't know anything about college. I was very embarrassed about that. I didn't want anybody to know that I didn't know anything about college. So I applied to the colleges that they were applying to, even though I didn't really know much about them. I applied to a couple of schools I'd never heard of. One was called the University of Chicago. Another one was called Northwestern University. I thought both of them were basically community colleges. I didn't know what they were. But going to Joliet Catholic High School, the school where Rudy went, I also applied to, can you guess? Notre Dame. So I got into all of those schools. And that was nice. University of Chicago, that's fine. Northwestern was fine. But when Notre Dame accepted me, the principal of the school, Father Bob, announced it over the intercom that I was accepted to the University of Notre Dame. So of course I was going to go to Notre Dame. What a lucky accident. So I don't know what I had to do, what I did in that, but somehow I got into Notre Dame, went to Notre Dame. I met the love of my life, who is here completely by accident. But one other aspect of that. So I'm talking about privilege. Notre Dame at that time, and I believe still today, has this program for all freshmen. All freshmen are supposed to take what they call a first-year seminar. We have a similar program here at Wake Forest University. I was put into one. I didn't sign up for it. I was just put into a class. The very first book I read as a college student, so, you know, there weren't a lot of books around my house growing up because we didn't have a lot of money. But the first book I read in college was Homer's Iliad. That's still my all-time favorite book. When I read that book, I was transported into a different realm. This was a book that was written by somebody, some people, nearly 3,000 years ago. People have been reading that book for all of these centuries. I now felt as though I was brought into a community I had never been part of, which was a community of the mind. So the fact that I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, which was a lower middle class place, and I didn't have any of the money that many of the other students at Notre Dame had. I didn't grow up with a father. I felt enormously privileged, and I still do to this day, that I fell into that through a series of lucky accidents. I consider myself to have been enormously lucky, and I feel very privileged. So why do I say that? I think that being privileged to be part of a community, like a community of the mind or the life of the mind, imposes on me, and I take this very seriously, imposes on me a duty, a moral responsibility to make the best use I possibly can of those gifts that I have been given. So when I think about what are we supposed to be about at a university, that's front and center for me. I was very lucky. I am very privileged. I teach at a place called Wake Forest. This is an awesome job. Can you imagine having a job where you get to, every day I get to get up and read things like David Hume. So I'm teaching in one of my classes this semester. Right now we're reading Jane Jacobs, so I have some students from my class. We're reading Jane Jacobs. Have you heard of Jane Jacobs? Yeah, Jane Jacobs. I get to teach and read Jane Jacobs. That is an enormously privileged life, and I thank my lucky stars every day that I have it. So when we talk about the purpose of a university, I think something that all of us professors need to do is to ask ourselves and give an answer to the question, why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? And every minute that we have, that we live in this very privileged life, we need to be asking ourselves, what duties does this impose on us? What responsibilities do we have to others? So when we talk about free speech and safe spaces, so I assume that's maybe where you want to talk, I'll let you get in now. When we talk about free speech and safe spaces, I think before we even get to that, we need to have a sense of what the first principles are. And the first principles are we need to answer that question, what are we really about? Come to a sense of our identity. Now, maybe we'll have differing views about that, but I think we owe it to ourselves as a part of the scholarly community, professors, but also in our duty to students, faculty, staff, our community, we need to answer that question. Ask it and answer it. And too often we don't ask those questions, and we need to do so, and we need to answer them.
Thanks for setting the stage a little better for our conversation. And I think, you know, if we're talking about the purpose of a university, few would question the notion that one of the purposes is learning and debate. And I will re-ask the question of what it means to create a space that is safe for learning and for debate, or whether safe is even the right word. Is that even what universities are in the business of doing if we're talking about purpose and role?
It's an important question, so I appreciate you re-asking it. Free speech. So we had a panel discussion this morning. Some of you may have been there on free speech and safe spaces. Notice we didn't say free speech versus safe spaces, but that's actually how people often think of it and how they talk about it, that there's a conflict between the two. Here's how I would put that. The university's job is to create a safe space for free speech. That's what it is. You know, we all operate in lots of different communities. So I'm a professor, I'm a husband, I'm a father. We all have these different roles. We have different communities that we're parts of. Even though we're individual people, we have these different communities. And sometimes there are different norms that apply to the different communities. What goes on at a university? Think about the lives of students. So you come out of, you're a minor, you're living with your parents or under the tutelage of somebody. What do your parents or your guardians, what do they do the whole time you're growing up? They're telling you what to do. My children can attest. Right? We tell you what to do. You're going to do this, you got to do this, here's your bedtime. Just about everything we're telling you what to do. When students graduate from college, what are they going to do then? They're going to get a job, and wherever they get a job, what's going to happen? They're going to get told what to do. This is the period where they get to explore. So I think the job of a main job of a university is to create a safe space for free speech. Now, we have to be very careful about that. And I think it's a two-way street. What I mean by that is when we talk about students, wanting students to engage in free speech, so we want to have, I don't even want to talk about Richard Spencer. We want to have a controversial speaker. We want to have a controversial speaker, and you say, well, we're just, you know, these students, I mean, we've all heard, I think you've written about it. We've all heard people talk about, well, these coddled snowflakes. You know, the students, they get upset about ideas. Well, hold on a second. So when I say that our job is to create a safe space for free speech, what I think that means is think about what it means to be in a community that matters to you. So not one you just end up in because you were put there, but a community that you join or want to be part of that means something to you. Whatever kind of community that is, one of the things that's going to be part of it is there is a bedrock that you can count on. There's something about that community that matters that you can count on. Sometimes a family is like that. Sometimes a religious group is like that. Sometimes where you live, your geographical location. There's something you can count on. What should so apply that to the university. What should the university provide its students that they can count on? What I think we should say to every student is, whatever your background, wherever you come from, whatever beliefs you have, we are going to value you as an individual and as a person, regardless of whatever crazy ideas you get into your head. We are still going to value you. We are going to listen to you, we are going to respect you, and we're going to value you. Once we say that, now what we can say is, now go take risks with your thoughts. Once students understand, and we make a credible case, I think, and that's not easy, it's easier said than done, but we make a credible case to all of our students that, yes, this is a space where we are not going to hold your crazy idea that you're going to entertain for 5 minutes against you forever. We're not going to judge you. So I sometimes have to tell my students, you know, they think that if I give them the grade I give you on your paper is my judgment of you as a moral person. No, it's just a grade on a paper. We're not going to judge you as a person, your humanity based on some idea that you're going to entertain here. Once we can credibly say that to students, then I think what we can demand of students is now take risks. Now is the time when it's okay for you to go ahead and contemplate and talk about and debate all of the ideas that you're not going to be able really to talk about ever again. The rest of your life you're going to spend still having to constrain yourself because you're working or you have these other responsibilities. Here is the time. So I think we should not think of these things as in contest, free speech and safe spaces. I think we should see them as being complementary. This is a safe space for you to engage in free speech. One last little point about that. You know, so I studied in the 18th century. You brought it up, so I'm going to, is that all right if I mention? One of my favorite authors is Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, came out in 1748. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, you should go read it. He makes a very striking argument. So he's talking about what he thinks is going to be the coming commercial age. So commercial society is, commerce is going to take over the world. Is it going to be good or bad? Montesquieu makes the argument that, well, the more commerce we have, the more trade we have, if we have free trade, we're going to get richer. So he makes this prediction. We're going to make, so wealth and prosperity are going to increase. Okay. But he makes a different, another prediction, which is, I think, even more striking. He says the more trade you have, the more that people's animosities will decrease. Hatreds will go down. People will stop hating one another if you're from a different country, or you're a different color, or you're a different religion. Why? Because people will come to see, this is what he said, they'll come to see other people, people who are different from them, not as enemies to be feared, but as opportunities. That's an important and fundamental change in mindset. Well, while you're thinking about that idea, whether you think that's true or not, I think something similar can apply to universities and colleges. We often are afraid of ideas and perspectives we don't know anything about. And if the only familiarity we have with views that are different from ours is what we got from Twitter or from a blog post, then we don't really understand those ideas. And so we can envision all sorts of monsters and demons in our minds. One of the things that's important, I think, about the safe space for free speech is to defang and demystify different views. Encountering different views don't hurt you. We're going to talk about violence and speech. They don't hurt you the way violence can. They might be uncomfortable, but I think the mind is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised and stretched. In order for it to grow, it needs to be exercised and stretched. And I think if we fear or are afraid of ideas that are different from ours, then that's going to cause all sorts of barriers, and in the end, we'll be the losers for it. And I think all of us will.
So it is one thing to play devil's advocate. It is one thing to say, sort of in theory, that everyone should be able to say just about anything. But what about when that language targets the vulnerable? That, I think, changes the calculus a little bit, and it raises the question of whether speech can become violent. And it's something that I've been observing college campuses having to grapple with in ways that they haven't really had to grapple with before, having to grapple with the views of really, really extreme voices that do target minority communities. So what about that?
I think it's a fair question. I also think it's, well, not just fair, I think it's one that we have to think about and have to talk about. So we can imagine, if you imagine a spectrum, disinterested provision of information on the one hand, so verbal information, that doesn't bother anybody, violence or coercion or attacks on the other end. So the question is, where does that, on that continuum, does speech get to sort of at the tipping point? Maybe, if not violence, incitement to violence. I think people of good faith can have differing views about that. What I would say is, so, and maybe I have a higher tolerance for hearing different views, having gone to the University of Chicago. So when I was at Chicago, I've told some of my students this, when I was a brand new graduate student at the University of Chicago, the practice then as now is that if you're a PhD student and you've written a dissertation, the last thing you do before you get your degree is you have a public defense of your dissertation. Just think about that now, a public defense, anybody can go. So I attended one of a graduate student who was in my department and who had gotten her, I was new and she was on her way out. And that was the most harrowing experience. I don't know how she made it out of that experience. I thought it was horrible the way they treated her. Calling her confused, and maybe she wasn't up to the task, and can she really even understand the words she herself is writing? And I mean, they said things like that, which I thought, well, holy cow, why did they let her get this far? If they really had that opinion of her, why did they let her? And they passed her. Yeah, they passed her because, well, this is just what we do at Chicago. Okay, well, if that's your experience, well, then you learn to adapt to something like that. Not everybody has an experience like that. Now, you asked about targeting people. So let's think about that. When people target other people. So here's something, the Chicago principles distinguish between, they say we are willing to potentially punish conduct, but we're not willing to punish speech. That presumes a kind of bright line between the two. But is some speech actually an incitement or tantamount to conduct? Here's my, again, philosophical answer to that. It depends. I think so. I think that there is no single principle or single mechanical rule that will allow you to adjudicate that in every case. I think sometimes you need to have good judgment. Are there cases in which what people are saying are flirting with or going over the line of not just talking about ideas, but actually incitement to violence? There are. Will we always agree on what those are? No. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about them, and there will be cases where people of good faith disagree. So I think, in my view, we should err on the side of letting people speak, unless it's clearly a case where it's leading to incitement to violence. And one way that I'll give you one example to think about this. Some of you may know a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Somali, former Muslim activist. I heard her speak once, and this is what she said. So she gives talks about Islam and women and its treatment of women. And it's very controversial, as you might guess. And she gets death threats. And what she says is, here's the difference. She says, I often hear people say to me, I hate you and I hope you die. That's okay. Then sometimes she hears, I hate you and I'm going to kill you. That's not okay. Now, sometimes it's not clear where one is almost the other and not, okay. So do you want to hear people say things like, I hate you and I hope you die? No. No, you don't. But if we have a safe space for free speech, then even odious speech like that, I think, is going to have to be tolerated until it becomes that other speech.
Yeah, and on the question of if we're going to, so obviously there are some extreme situations where there are controversial speakers and students shouting them down, and that, as we have talked about, is quite rare. What more often the idea on campuses is to have places where difficult and controversial issues can be discussed, and there have to be spaces where that can happen. Obviously, this conference is supposed to be one of them. Are there ways, how can colleges teach about civil debate and discussion? This is something as I mentioned, I'm hearing from administrators that they're concerned that students aren't necessarily listening to one another and that they don't necessarily come to the university with the skills that they need to engage in these kinds of conversations. If the ideal is not to have this animated exchange of words, how do colleges teach that?
Well, that's obviously that's an old question. How many of you remember Plato's Meno? Anybody remember the dialogue Meno? Nobody. The very first line of Plato's Meno is a question put to Socrates, and it is, can virtue be taught? Socrates takes this question seriously. That's a hard question. Can you teach somebody to be virtuous? And I think this is a modern, a contemporary version of this question. How do we teach the right sorts of mental attitudes, which might include certain kinds of virtues? You know, when we think about people like Richard Spencer, so here's my dream with respect to Dr. King. I would love for Richard Spencer to show up for his talk and nobody to be there. Wouldn't that be a great thing? Should a person like Richard Spencer be able to speak? Yes. Does he have a right to speak? Okay. Does he have a right for us to listen to him? No. And wouldn't it be wonderful if not just students, faculty, staff, media, just ignored people like that? So here's my view about this. One way that we teach the right kinds of approaches to free speech, we teach by example, is by doing it. That's why a conference like this is so great. We show it. So for those of you who've been here for other parts of the conference earlier today, we've had some rather spirited discussions and some rather spirited disagreements. So I was in a session earlier this morning on individual fulfillment versus service to others. And we had to call a close to that conversation, even though there were about 10 hands that were still up. That's awesome. That's what a university experience should be like. So we had a couple of speakers, one of whom is in the audience. They started out, so I was the moderator, and again, this is my Chicago coming out in me. They started out agreeing too much, I thought. They were talking about, you know, getting better together, individual fulfillment by service to others, and I thought, well, let's really see if we can create something. So we started asking questions like, well, when should an individual be willing to or be required to sacrifice himself or herself to the society or to the community? What can a community demand in sacrifice from an individual? Oh, well, and that's when we started to have a difference. I mean, and that ended up with all sorts of, for those of you who were there, that went down all sorts of interesting directions. Everything from, is capitalism good, to name a regulation that works. So one way, I think, that we can teach the kinds of mental and moral attitudes, I think, intellectual virtues and moral virtues, is by showing it, by doing it. So this, I think, goes back to what I would call a kind of professionalism. So I consider myself, I'm a professor, but I consider myself a professional. And part of what that means is I need to act the way I want my students to act. I need to be, or try to be, the thing that I want others to be. And my first duty is to make sure that I'm trying to do that. I mean, we all fail in our goals. Nobody's perfect. But I think what we have to do is, if we want people to respect our ideas, what's the first step? Can you complete my sentence? Respect theirs. That's the first step. And not just talking about it, but actually doing it, I think, is the most important. The witness of an example is perhaps the most powerful moral example there is. Now I'm a parent. I've spent a lot of time giving my children lectures about things, as they could attest. I don't know whether they pay any attention to that. Do you guys pay attention when your parents give you lectures about things? Do this, this is moral and whatever. You know, yeah. I think it's much more powerful when they see the way you act. They see the way you behave. Do you treat other people with respect? One final example about this, Sarah. So since I have a couple of my students in the room today, just last week, was it last week, guys? You had your first paper due, so you wrote the first paper of the semester for me. And before they turned it in, I said to my students, I want you to know, and I tell this to all my students, I want you to know that when you turn in your paper to me, I'm going to read it with all of the care that I assume you will have put into writing it. So I won't skim it. I won't just look at the first couple of sentences and the last couple of sentences. I'm going to read every single word you write, every sentence, every paragraph, every period, comma, semicolon, colon. And the reason for that is not because I want to make you nervous. Maybe it has that effect. That's not why I'm doing it, but because I want to show you respect. That's the respect I think I owe you as a student. I'm asking you, demanding you. You have to write a paper. Well, what do I owe you in return for that? As a professional, I think I see part of my duty as being, I'm going to give you all of the respect that I think I'm demanding of you for me. And until I do that, then any words we say about community and mutual respect, then it rings hollow. So you have to be the thing you want and show with your actions the thing you want others to be.
I'll offer a couple of examples of what other universities are doing on the trying to teach students about civil debate and civil discussion. So Purdue University is one of the first that has actually created a freshman orientation session. I'm sure some of you guys probably saw at freshman orientation, they probably had some kind of session about respect and you know, everyone's a little bit different, comes from different backgrounds, it's okay. This one was really focused on debate, discussion, and the First Amendment. And there were a series of skits that played out about how sort of these issues play out on campus, including in the last skit, where to exemplify speech as violence, two students threw lettuce heads at a PETA activist in order to show violence. It was very funny. So that's one way that, so in that case, the lettuce heads are weapons, and that is violence. And
Are they actual people they were throwing these at?
Yes, that was the skit, was that there were actually people throwing lettuce heads. And while that might not be the way that a protest typically plays out, it provides a good example. Another university that's been thinking a lot about this is Cornell, and they have a regular series of dinners where they invite students from two sort of opposing student organizations, whether it's you know, the Democrats and the college Republicans, or it's a black student group with the fraternities. They come together. There's food free food that will get students to show up, right? And they come together and they just have a couple of hours of conversation over food. And they have to sit next to people they don't know and they've never talked to, and they just have a conversation about it. So those are two examples that I've reported on. And one interesting thing, and that I was sort of observing this morning as I was in the opening session, is that when it goes right, when civil debate and discussion goes right, it's not necessarily newsworthy. It's not something that the news media is necessarily going to cover. And that does add another dimension to this, because, I mean, we are much more likely to, the national media is much more likely to cover an event like this if Milo Yiannopoulos is standing up here and there are students shouting, and versus having an actual, just sitting down and having an intellectual discussion.
So I think what I heard you say is that the media is to blame for these things on
No.
campus? Isn't that what she said? I'm pretty sure she said that. Yeah. We don't always pay attention to the good stuff that goes on, because the good stuff is kind of boring. You know, last April, the Eudaimonia Institute held its first, it says new institute, held its first academic conference, and we had some media presence there. And I think the media presence was, you know, hoping that there would be something that would go on other than a bunch of academics talking about all academic-y things. And I talked with the reporter afterwards. She interviewed me afterwards, and she said, well, I don't know, how'd you think the conference went? And talking with her, it became clear to me that she couldn't really figure out why she was there. She was trying to write she was supposed to write a story about it, but, you know, it was this conference about what is eudaimonia, how can you measure it. We had these competing views about, you know, whether it could be measured. You know, you have economists, with apologies to economists in the room, who think you can measure these sorts of things and run some regressions, and you had other people who thought, no, this is something that can't be measured in that empirical sort of way. What a boring conference. I thought it was fantastic. I love those discussions, because that's what's interesting. We had disagreements about methodology, about substance, about who Aristotle was and what he meant by eudaimonia. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't get covered in the media. Now, I understand that the Chronicle is a for-profit organization, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Owned by the Washington Post?
No.
Owned by Bezos? No. Who owns you?
No, we're just owned by a private owner.
Okay. All right.
No, Bezos hasn't taken us over yet.
Just give him time. Yeah, any minute. So, I mean, I understand that there are demands when you have to be responsive to a certain kind of audience, and there are some people, including in this room, who have had to spend time thinking about audiences in a way that's very different from the way you think about audiences of students. But it would be nice if we could spend less time paying attention to the anomalies, to the strange thing that happens, to the student who does something that none of the other students on campus are really paying attention. I mean, this conference. So, Rethinking Community is a theme of Wake Forest University, announced by the provost. We're all talking about it. We've got a board and a committee and things going on. My students, I talked to them. I think I mentioned it last week. I guess I mentioned it. Said, you guys know about the Rethinking Community theme of the university, right? No, never heard of it. Oh, well, that means, now, is that a bad thing? I mean, in some sense. But it means they're doing something. They have things to do. That's great. What are they thinking about? The book they're reading, the class they're going to, the lecture they're going to do. That's what we should be. It would be great if people had the idea that what goes on campus, which is true, what goes on most campuses most of the time is students just trying to do their jobs. It'd be nice if the media paid attention.
Well, I will ask one more. I will ask one more big picture question. You want to take a question from the audience?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll ask one more big picture question of you, of just whether, on the question of, you never know when something could happen at an institution. The campus climate is such where, this is actually it's interesting because the campus climate is so fraught and tense in many places right now that you never really know when something is going to spark tension. and cause something to break out. Universities have to deal with that uncertainty, and to some extent, the news media has to deal with it as well. I mean, we sometimes, again, we will send a reporter to a campus, and perhaps there's nothing happening except for the speaker says what he or she is going to say, and the students listen. There's a Q&A, and that's it. And so you never know. And so because there is a risk of something happening in this campus climate, I mean, what does it mean to say, we're going to support free speech? It seems like an easy posture to take for a university. I mean, freedom of expression, academic freedom seem fundamental to a university's mission. But what does it mean in an environment where that could carry risk to the campus community?
Well, the fact that we want to support, if we want to support free speech doesn't mean we need to listen to everybody who wants to speak. And I don't think that those two principles are in conflict. They often talked about as if they're in conflict. I don't think they are. We have scarce resources here at Wake Forest University to take our university. We can't have every speaker who wants to speak. We have to make choices. So the fact that somebody might have a right in the abstract to speak doesn't mean we're actually going to extend an invitation. And I think one of the duties of professors is, students are going to be interested. So, there's some students who want to bring, there might be students here on Wake Forest campus who would like to bring out Milo or, who's the other person we talked to? Oh, Richard Spence. Oh, gosh. I don't know. But one of the things that we can do as professors is exercise our professorial judgment about things. Who are speakers who are going to actually contribute to enriching the life of the mind as opposed to detracting from it? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to agree. That's not what it is. But who are people who have arguments, ideas, evidence, who are going to make a case for something? And I think if we ask ourselves that question, that actually gets rid of a lot of the posers and pretenders. There are a lot of posers and pretenders who get invited to campus because, for various kinds of political or other reasons, who actually aren't making an argument about anything. They're not giving you evidence for anything. They're not inviting you to look into a perspective and giving you a chance to commune with it and come out with it whatever you can. Instead, they're doing something else. And if we asked ourselves honestly, well, here's a whole roster of speakers that have been suggested to us, and we didn't have political litmus tests, but we had a litmus test like, who's actually going to enrich the environment? Who are we going to learn from? That's a totally different kind of conversation. So even if all of them in some abstract way abstract sense have a right to speak, that doesn't mean we have to give them a platform. I'd like to see us exercise some actual professorial judgment about it. Some people are just not worth listening to. So again, I'll go back to my University of Chicago roots. One of my great professors, so, this is how things go at Chicago. I wrote a paper for him. He passed away recently, very sadly. His name was Ian Mueller. He was a great scholar of ancient Greek. He's a Plato scholar principally. Anyway, I wrote a paper for him, and this is what he said to me. He read the paper, and he said, well, Jim, look, it's not sufficient to criticize an author by assuming that your author is some combination of stupid, naive, or evil. Because if you just assume that whoever you're opposing or whoever you're criticizing is stupid, naive, some combination of stupid, naive, or evil, why are you talking about them? Why bother? Life's too short. The intellectual life is too precious to waste on people who are stupid, naive, or evil. So either you're not taking that author seriously enough and you need to go back and take another look, or you need to stop reading that, or you need to stop talking about that. I think that's a really important principle, and I think that that's the sort of thing that we should be imparting to our students. If you really think that the argument you're encountering, or the person you're listening to, or the book you're reading, or the blog post, or whatever it is, if you just go into it, or even come away from it thinking that person is stupid, naive, or evil, one of those three, not worth your time. Life's too precious. Think about looking for people who are actually sophisticated representatives of a view that maybe you don't support or that you don't know about. Find the best. Go up against the best. And if you refute somebody who's the best who opposes you, that's accomplishing something. You refute somebody who's stupid, naive, or evil, who cares?
Then you, to play devil's advocate, you have to decide who gets to make those decisions.
Yeah, and that's what we get paid for, isn't it? I mean, we're professors. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do, and I don't think we should be afraid to do that. I think we should not be afraid to say, you know, some books are not worth reading. And by the way, that's true. So forgive me, some columnists are not worth reading. And I think we need to be not afraid to say that. Now, the other part of that, though, is if we say that, we better be willing to justify that. So if I say this is an author not worth reading, then I better be willing to stand up and give my reasons publicly for why I think that is. If I can't do that, then maybe I should just keep my mouth shut. But I think that professors have a duty, and that's part of our job. Let's do our job.
All right. Without further ado, I think we'll open it up, see if anybody would like to ask any questions.
On a beautiful Friday afternoon.
Yes.
That's part of the question about community, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and whether or not, because I love what you said, Jim, about first principles. What are we doing, right? We should be, and so that story about like that aspiration, what college is, where we're going.
I mean, and particularly for this university, given its motto. What is our motto? Students? Well, that was kind of weak, lame. Pro humanitate. So we have mentioned several times, haven't we, that Wake Forest is one of the few universities that where people actually pay attention to that motto. And for a university with a motto like that, that's something I think we need to take very, very seriously. We need to think very carefully about that. We have a mission of service. Now, we might have different views about exactly what constitutes the right kind of service, what constitutes service, but we have a mission of service. And when we're thinking about our community, this is an interesting community that we live in here. We had some of the statistics earlier. about access to food, educational differentials. Those are things we should take quite seriously. I mean, I think sometimes we think, and maybe, it flatters our sensibilities to have a kind of exclusivity. We like to think about, oh, it's an elite place, and it makes us feel better if we're at an elite place. The two of us at this table, now you went to North Carolina Chapel Hill, didn't you? We won't hold that against you. I'm sorry. At least it
we can agree on
too.
something.
But I think that is something we need to think very, very seriously. Now, I will say one other thing about that, though, Melissa. So maybe you and I would disagree about this. I'm not sure. I don't think college is right for everybody. So I don't think it's true that you can't lead a fulfilling and valuable life unless you go to college. I think there are many people who think that, and I think many people, students and professors, I mean, professors went to college, so we like to think highly of ourselves. So you might think that, oh, well, this is some special credit I should get having gone to college. But there are lots of different kinds of lives that can be flourishing, eudaimonic, valuable. Not all of them need to go to college. And I think that's very important to say. So just last night on the news, there's a story about how we need Winston-Salem is desperately trying to hire construction workers. We don't have any construction workers. Okay. There are many kinds of lives, and I think it's important for us to recognize that different people can lead different kinds of lives. Nevertheless, there are also many people for whom the right kind of life is through a university education who are not, for all sorts of reasons, able to actually get there. And I think that is a moral duty on us to figure out who those people are and bring them into the community. And that's easier said than done, but I think it's something we need to work on.
So to talk a little more about your question, I mean, sort of part of what you were saying is that we pay a disproportionate amount of attention and spend a disproportionate amount of our time talking about safe spaces when we've got real problems to worry about. Is that part of sort of your concern? Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, this isn't addressing the question of getting more of these students in the door, but I mean, scholars that I talk to in terms of getting students to the finish line, as you said, that part of the challenge is making sure that they don't drop out, and part of that needs to be addressed in the classroom. And that's why it is important to talk about, in their view, about creating safe spaces for learning, creating spaces where, like, quite frankly, white men are not dominating the conversation, where there is a space for all voices in a given classroom. So I think scholars I talk to who are really focused on the sort of safe space thing in terms of for learning, that's part of their, I think what I'm saying is they're not mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, fair enough. Yeah. I take your point. So let me clarify what I think I was trying to say, but maybe I didn't express it very well. When I said that I should use my professorial judgment, what I'm thinking about is things like, what are we going to read in my class? Not what speakers get to come to the campus. That's not up to me. Now, I'm going to make a judgment about who I will invite to campus, and you will make a judgment about who you would like to invite to campus, and maybe we agree and maybe we don't agree. You use your professional judgment, I use my professional, and maybe we just we're in different fields, or we just have different interests, that's all fine. But what I'm suggesting, what I think the claim I would defend, is that when any one of us professors, we assign certain texts, we teach certain courses, we invite certain guest speakers, we need to be ready, able, prepared, and willing to make the case for why we invited those people and not others. And it shouldn't just be we want to shock or get in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It should be, here's my argument for why this is worth listening to. And I think that if we ask people that, a lot of the speakers in the past who haven't been invited, well, they would have been. If that was the criterion, if somebody's going to if you want to make an argument for why this is someone who wants to, who we should bring to campus, that's going to win. I think just the willingness to actually make an argument can distinguish between a whole lot of good and bad, a whole lot of wheat and chaff. So I didn't mean to be saying some person should be making a decision for the university about who the university should invite. In fact, I think that the university should, almost strictly speaking, be neutral and agnostic about it. If there's a faculty member, a student group, a group of students, a group of staff, faculty who want to bring out a speaker, I think the default should almost always be yes. And the content of the view should not be for the administration to ask them to be reviewing. That's the job of the students, the professors, the staff, the people who want to bring it out. Yeah. Maybe we're on the same page.
I think one thing I'll add to that is that I do hear from, given that some students are reacting to the sort of current campus climate, the polarization by inviting provocateurs to campus, there are a number of administrators that I talk to who, when a student group voices the desire to bring someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, the administrator will sit down with the student group and say, let's at least have a conversation about what your goals are. And so the goal is not to say you cannot bring this speaker, but let's at least talk about why you want to bring this person to campus. And in some cases, I think the students have made a different decision. In other cases, I have seen the administration say, we are disinviting this person. And I think that's what you sort of pulled out as very kind of problematic, potentially. All right.
Any other questions? Shall we? All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you, Dr. Otteson and Ms. Brown, for a fantastic conclusion to the main part of the second day of the Rethinking Community Conference.